The descent to Veera was quieter than Salana had imagined. The ship slid through a sky the color of polished stone, and outside the observation port, the blue moon hung low, a pale lantern over a world that breathed light. Her hair caught the afterglow, turquoise threaded with purple, and she pressed the heel of her hand to the glass as if she could steady the pull in her chest. All her life she had catalogued patterns, named spectrums, reduced the unknown to graphs and probabilities. This was the moment she had trained for. The part she had not trained for was the way her chest tightened with a personal gravity the instruments could not measure. Jack was on the bridge 2 decks above, voice clipped and professional. They had been together for 3 years, a careful orbit of shared labs, late nights calibrating sensors, the soft rituals of domesticity in orbit, until they were not. When the mission roster had come down, so had the awkwardness of their separation. Now the silence between them hummed like something set to charge. "Approach vector in 30, the captain announced. The other crew moved with efficient calm. Salana lingered at the viewport. Veera rolled beneath them, a field of bioluminescent flora like a slow aurora, veins of luminescent water threading between glassy black rocks. A distant pulse, barely a ripple on the ship's external sensors, crossed the planet, and then another, like someone tapping an enormous drum beneath the crust. Whatever it was, it sent a current through the hull that the crew felt in their teeth. Salana felt it as a curiosity, something raw and alive calling. She had read the preliminary data, atypical electromagnetic fluctuations, coherent frequencies repeating in a pattern that suggested communication rather than random geology. Her fingers met the glass, and she thought of the long hours in the lab back on Earth, of stacking problems into neat piles to be solved. Here, the problem smelled of ozone and wildflowers, and the first possibility that the universe might answer back. Jack came up behind her then, quieter than she expected. He did not touch her. The margin between them was thick with the awkwardness of ex-lovers trying to be crewmates, but he said, softly, "You ready?" "Always," she replied, though she was not sure which meaning she offered. She did not say that she felt ridiculous for being afraid, or that the fear sat next to something that was not fear at all, a pull toward whatever waited on that surface. She had always called it curiosity. Tonight it felt more like hunger. They touched down in a place where the air seemed to carry light itself. The suits flicked with bioluminescent dust when they stepped out. Spores caught in the weave of fabric and glowed like distant stars. The team moved as a unit, boots making black prints that lasted only seconds before the light reclaimed them. Sensors ticked at the edge of their helmets, quietly complaining about readings that didn't match any known baseline. Then the pulse returned, sharpened, and the team followed. It led them along a stream whose water shivered with internal light and into a corridor of lichens that hummed beneath gloved fingers. The frequency intensified near a cavern mouth, a soundless vibrato that seemed to ride on the throat of the forest. The field team tethered at the mouth and looked into a chamber that breathed light rather than air. Inside, walls hung with curtains of living light. Bioluminescent fronds pulsed in a slow rhythm that matched whatever song the planet sang. At the center of the chamber, tall as 2 humans and broader than any species Salana had ever catalogued, stood a figure of living radiance. Its skin was a tapestry of glowing lines, moving slowly like currents on a map. It had the vertical grace of something that had never needed to hide, limbs long, fingers like the fine roots of deep trees, a face that was unsettlingly open, with 2 deep-set eyes that reflected the blue moon. The creature's presence was not terrifying in the way predators were terrifying. It carried an authority older than the team. Jack's breath fogged the inside of his visor when he stepped forward. "Keep it clinical," he said, voice steady enough for the others to hear. There was a reason the mission had protocols, unknown life forms, unknown motives. Salana's job was to study, to be the bridge. Jack's had always been to protect that bridge from collapse. The rules felt brittle now, paper shields against the living, breathing privacy. The alien, the word felt inadequate, but it was all they had, did not move in any frantic way. It shifted, a ripple across its chest like a tide. Nurth, Salana thought, the name rising unbidden from the lexicon in her head. A guardian, an elder gene the planet had grown to remember. The creature tilted its head. There was a moment where everything slowed. The hum, the light, the small mechanical breaths. Sound collapsed into meaning without translation. Salana felt, rather than heard, an invitation. She stepped forward first, because she had always been the one to step. Even when Jack's hand had been the first to reach for hers 3 years ago, it had been her who set the cadence. This time she moved without asking, palm out in a gesture she had practiced in base simulations 1,000 times. Non-threatening, open, the universal offering across species on half a dozen training modules. The alien's fingers extended, and there was an almost affectionate reluctance in the way its hand descended. There was contact, and it was not contact as any human had made it. Where their skins met, light rose like breath. It was not warmth in the temperature sense, it was an internal illumination that spread through her bones, not burning but rearranging. The alien, the word felt inadequate, but it was all they had, did not move in any frantic way. It shifted, a ripple across its chest like a tide. Nurth, Salana thought, the name rising unbidden from the lexicon in her head. A guardian, an elder gene the planet had grown to remember. The creature tilted its head. There was a moment where everything slowed, the hum, the light, the small mechanical breaths. Sound collapsed into meaning without translation. Salana felt, rather than heard, an invitation. She stepped forward first, because she had always been the one to step. Even when Jack's hand had been the first to reach for hers 3 years ago, it had been her who set the cadence. This time she moved without asking, palm out in a gesture she had practiced in base simulations 1,000 times. Non-threatening, open, the universal offering across species on half a dozen training modules. The alien's fingers extended, and there was an almost affectionate reluctance in the way its hand descended. There was contact, and it was not contact as any human had made it. Where their skins met, light rose like breath. It was not warmth in the temperature sense, it was an internal illumination that spread through her bones, not burning, but rearranging. If this first contact story is the kind of thing you love, subscribe. There are more moments like this on the way. The days that followed took on a montage quality, the kind of sequence Salana might have compiled for a long presentation. Observation, exchange, small discoveries. She returned to the cave under a tent of technique, and also with the private gravity that refused to be catalogued. Nurth came when she called, not by human sound, but by doing what the planet did, changing the glow of a corridor, leaving a trail of light that answered a rhythm. They learned vocabulary together. The alien taught her to feel the syntactic pulses of Veera, to touch a root and know the weather of the valley, to press a palm to a rock and feel the migration patterns of tiny airborne lumens like sentence fragments of migration. They exchanged gifts. She offered samples and data patches. He presented her with gossamer petals that dripped light like dew. Once, he spread a handful of the glowing flowers on a flat stone and motioned for her to place her hand among them. The light crawled across her skin, and the moment became a kind of proof. 2 systems could translate without words. Every little victory became a fissure in the space between Salana and Jack. He tried to be present, to be the man the mission needed. He asked technical questions in brief bursts, trying to insert himself into the moments between her and Nurth. But there was a quality to what happened in the cave that protocol did not anticipate. Intimacy formed not through human touches, but through sustained understanding, a sharing that seeped into Salana and rearranged something vital. She would come back to the camp with descriptions that were inadequate, eyes glittering with awe. He listened and asked the safety questions, and then asked, without quite meaning to, if she had thought about the consequences. "What consequences?" she asked once, tending to a luminescent petal that drifted in her cupped hands like a soft sun. Jack watched her fingers. "Of being the bridge," he said. "Of the way you change when you come back." There was an ache under the practicality in his voice, a personal plea dressed in operational concern. She tried to explain. She told him about the way the touch worked like a translation protocol, how Nearth's skin patterns mapped into something like memory, and how the planet's pulse could be understood as intention. Jack's eyes softened when she used professional terms. They hardened when she confessed instead. She told him once about the way the energy felt in an intimate tone she never had for him in years of a shared bed. "It rewrites the inside of you," she said. "It doesn't remove me. It adds something that isn't human." Jack heard her, but felt another narrative pressing at his ribs, loss dressed in the language of danger. He could imagine the mission report. A human entangling with an intelligent organism, the risk of contamination, physiological and psychological. He could imagine command deciding to remove her, to quarantine her, and the data they had barely begun to understand. He could imagine people on Earth reading about this and saying how foolish they had been to let a human form a bond. But amidst these rational fears, something harder grew, an almost primitive muscle of possessiveness. Years of companionship had formed a pattern in him that would not recalibrate easily. He found himself watching the way Salana's shoulders eased around Nearth's presence. He watched how she smiled at small things, a petal's twitch, the way the cave's light patterned off a surface, and felt the tightness of jealousy fold over him. He remembered the last time they had drifted from each other, the small compromises unattended until they had accumulated into absence. Now that absence seemed to want to lodge itself into any space not occupied by the alien. When she came back from the cave after a long exchange, cheeks flushed with light and hands full of new terminology, he said something he thought was careful. "Promise me you won't go back alone." She met his gaze, and she could see the fear in him, cold and defensive. "I won't," she promised, which was true in the way promises can be, based on the present, but not a guarantee against a feeling that might pull at her later. She could not promise the planet away. Their relationship changed into a triangle whose axis the planet's glow had carved. Salana found herself carrying two kinds of light, the literal afterglow under her skin that would sometimes show on the wrists like faded tattoos, an emotional luminance that made her laugh in the quiet of the module. Nearth's presence simplified certain things. It also complicated others. The team proposed structured interactions, observation windows that placed Jack in supervisory roles intended to protect. Protocols meant to soothe anxiety sometimes had the opposite effect. The more formal it became, the more Jack felt sidelined. He tried to reach across the wideness. He offered to help with instrumentation. He stood at the cave entrance some evenings and took photographs of the slow choreography between Salana and Nearth. Sometimes he brought her coffee, the instant kind that tasted of nothing but heat, and she accepted it because it was him and because her hands trembled after being near living light. She appreciated these small gestures. She did not know how to answer the way they remade him, or how to return the kind of single-mindedness she had developed for the other. One afternoon, alone in the lab, Jack sat staring at the sample of the glowing flower in the containment chamber. The petals were dim here, the containment dampening their bloom. He could see how they refracted on the stainless table and thought of Salana's hands cupping them. He had no intention, in earnest, of acting against her. The thought of being the person who breached trust repulsed him. Yet the thought kept coming back, animated by two forces: fear that she might lose herself to something non-human in such a way that she would no longer be placeable, and a visceral jealousy that could not be objectified away by logic. He took apart his own emotions like one might disassemble a faulty circuit. There was the rational part that could list consequences and ask for oversight, and there was another part that bared teeth. He tried to imagine what the mission might do if he presented evidence: lock her out of the cave pending review, require psychological assessment, even exfiltrate her if necessary. He moved through scenarios like a chess player testing different endgames, each one ending with him and Salana in different positions. At night he lay awake, thinking about proximity. He saw Salana laughing at something Nirth had done, a shallow tilt of a head that made the cave's light shimmer, and he felt small in an old, intimate way. She had been his partner. He had once been the repository of her private jokes, the person who had read the notes tacked to her workstation. Now the repository was the planet itself. The planet's attention was a warmth he could not compete with. The plan, when it began to form, was not a plan of malice as much as it was a plan of preservation dressed as intervention. Jack told himself he would be careful, that he would not harm anyone, that he would only gather data, only insert a stabilizing frequency, only create a temporary barrier if the bond seemed to risk her autonomy or the mission. He imagined Nirth as an intelligence that could be negotiated with, and he thought if he could show command a dangerous attractor, a human altered beyond predictable baseline, the team might be authorized to implement a forced separation for study. He whispered to himself that he would do what was necessary. The first step was simple: acquire a field emitter from the ship's experimental cache. It was small, a palm-sized cylinder designed for habitat trials. Nothing offensive, capable of generating frequencies in a narrow band to test sensory responses in alien flora. The equipment manifest listed it as harmless and experimental. Jack reassured himself with the manifest as if it were scripture. He signed the citation as required, his signature, methodical as ever, blurred on the paper machine. The official record would show a routine test. He would not say what he intended. In the mornings, Salana and Nirth worked with a patient choreography. They would press petals to palms and then watch light translate into biological data, and Salana's excitement was contagious. She recorded everything in meticulous notes, the lines slanting with the kind of architecture only a scientist possessed. Timestamps, spectra, speculative interpretation. Nirth would sometimes lean its luminous forehead near her ear, allowing currents of thought to brush the edge of her consciousness in images rather than words. For Salana, those images were not invasive, they were invitations. For Jack, they were proof that a boundary had shifted. He began to watch more than he touched. He followed her through the corridors with the emitter in a small rucksack, convincing himself he would only test it for evidence. The device's manual suggested calibrations that were tedious and neutral. He adjusted the way he breathed to steady himself so the subtle frequency he planned to emit would be accurate. Sometimes he found himself imagining her response. Would she flinch? Would she weep? Would she reach toward the alien in a movement that might be moored by whatever interference he sent? The question tore at him like a repeated low current. It was a cold night when he made his first move. The blue moon carved the shadows in sharp angles, and the bioluminescent plants pulsed at a rhythm that felt like the planet's breath. Salana had returned to the cave for a private exchange with Nirth, a scientifically approved observation window that the team had agreed upon. And Jack had positioned himself at an outcrop where he could see without being seen. He watched them through the darkness. The way Nerth extended a finger, and how Salana reciprocated. The way the cave's light rose and fell like an organ. He fitted the emitter into his palm, hidden in the dark, and checked the dial. The device was inert until powered. The first step, the one he was taking now, was merely positioning. He would calibrate from a distance, run a scan, gather evidence. That was his story. He believed it because belief was a way to avoid the moral fracture he felt opening beneath his feet. At the edge of the circle of light, between the luminous ferns and the cavern mouth, Jack touched the device as if it were a live ember. The small ring of LEDs along the top glowed faintly, reflecting off the wet stone. He imagined what it would do. A narrow band that might desynchronize the binding pattern long enough to harvest data on its mechanics. He rationalized every step, until rationalization began to feel like a second skin. He made his way closer, careful not to rustle the grasses. The cave hummed, and the sound was full of small lights like a sea breaking on glass. In the dim, Salana's face was a small landscape of moonlight and luminous residue. Nerth stood beside her, massive and gentle, its fingers tracing the same pattern at the edges of a petal. They were so engrossed, the way lovers can be engrossed, even across species, that they did not see the shadow detach itself from the line of rocks. Jack paused for a long time. He could pull back. He could return the emitter to the lab, place it on the table, and then face Salana and explain that he had been wrong to consider active interference. He could trust the mission, trust her judgment, and accept the orbit of a new, strange thing around the two of them. He could choose to be the man who offered faith rather than control. Instead, he tightened his fingers around the device. The external LED blinked once and then steadied to a slow pulse, like a mechanical heartbeat. He was not yet at the point of firing, not yet at the point where he would sever or scramble anything. But in the smallness of that preparation, hidden steps toward an uncertain action, he planted the first seed of betrayal. The thought of it lodged like a seed in the soft earth of his integrity. He told himself it would germinate only into proof, into justification. He told himself many things. From the cave, a soft laugh rose that was not human. Salana touched Nerth's arm and leaned in, listening in a way that had nothing to do with her instruments and everything to do with two beings recognizing a shared cadence. The planet's light washed over them, and the luminous filaments traced their silhouettes with gentle, approving hands. Jack took a single breath heavy with all the contradicting forces inside him and moved forward until the emitter's field would soon reach the periphery of the cave's glow. The device hummed a note that only sensitive equipment, and perhaps the planet itself, could register. In his mind, he had already rehearsed presenting the data. Cold graphs showing anomalous binding patterns, neutral language that would justify protective measures. He had convinced himself of a narrative in which he was the savior and not the saboteur. He stepped into the bioluminescent night holding the small cylinder like a sacrament. His shadow cut the luminous ferns, and for a moment the glow painted his face in colors Salana had once loved. He did not look at her. He could not bear to see her eyes when they learned the truth, whatever truth his device would carve out. He moved like someone bearing a necessary cruelty, someone certain they were acting for a greater good. The cave hummed, the planet pulsed, and on the lip of that sound, Jack's hand tightened once more around the emitter. He had already crossed from monitoring to active interference in the currency of intent. The first concrete step towards whatever would come had been made. It was small, a routine signed and an instrument lit, but beneath it was something larger. The tipping of love into a thing that could justify secrecy and momentary betrayal. Salana and Nurth remained oblivious in the warm center of their conversation, their gestures slow and mapped to a language older than any regulation. The flowers at their feet glowed like watchful suns. Above them, the blue moon kept its careful vigil. Jack moved through the underbrush, and the hum of the cave swelled as if aware of the approach. He paused at the threshold and considered, for the slimmest fraction of a heartbeat, turning back and letting the light have its way. Then he closed his eyes, opened them, and stepped across, with the first faint pulse of the emitter reaching out into a world that was not entirely prepared to receive it. The night took him in, and the cave answered with a slow, collecting intake of light.